Why does the richest continent keep being treated like a liability? In Burkina Faso, a country buried in gold, yet bankrupt in trust, something extraordinary unfolded. The United States, once the towering partner draped in promises, left. No warning, no speeches, just silence packed in steel crates and drone wings. But something even louder followed. Nothing happened. No collapse, no begging, no panic. The people of Burkina Faso didn't fall, they rose, and leading them was a soldier, young, unpolished, unbending, Captain Ibrahim Traore. He didn't just resist the silence, he rewrote its meaning, not with noise, but with roots, with decisions, with a chair pulled out from the old table and planted into the soil of Burkina Faso. This is not a story about what Trump did. It's about what Africa didn't need to do. It's about what Traoré saw when the world saw absence. If you believe in a new kind of Africa, don't just watch, stay, listen, and dream. Subscribe not for the video, but for the dream of Burkina Faso. They thought Burkina Faso would panic, that when the last chopper lifted off from the Sahel, the government would crumble, emergency meetings would erupt, and crowds would swarm Western embassies. But that did not happen. There was no red alert, no desperate calls. No one begged America to return. There was only silence. And it spoke volumes. Donald Trump called it burden shifting, a budgetary win. But in Burkina Faso, people called it the first time they truly saw each other. No more floodlights of assistance, no more humanitarian cloaks. Just one question remained. If America was never truly present, then what does its absence even mean? At the abandoned USAID headquarters, dust clung to dead monitors. Cables curled like dry veins. No more surveillance drones. No more aid-funded lunches with imported bread. And into that vacuum, Traoré walked in. Not in an armored vehicle, but with dust-stained boots passing soldiers still unpaid. He made no promises. He simply said, if they leave, we must learn how not to need them. For years, people believed Burkina Faso breathed through aid, that America was the last pillar holding back terror and poverty. But what was the truth? Insurgencies thrived, even when U.S. drones shadowed the skies. Local troops died waiting for permissions, and most aid evaporated into consultancy contracts and internal reports. Trump thought he was withdrawing leverage, but on the ground, no one was holding the rope anymore. In fact, no one believed in the hook either. When the final cargo departed from Agadez base, a local reporter asked, "Will our security collapse?" Traoré shook his head. "No, it was never built by them. It will not collapse, because now it begins." I said. And so, not with bullets, but with posture, Burkina Faso declared its independence. There were no riots, no speeches, just a decision to no longer call America the center. A question to you, watching this story. If you were a citizen of Burkina Faso that day, would you fear America's exit or feel relief that the illusion was finally gone? Comment below. Enough is enough. If you believe it's time, Africa no longer lives under someone else's light. He did not wear medals. He did not carry a Harvard degree. He was not chosen by the West. Ibrahim Traore was chosen by absence. When the Americans packed up their bases, when the French media went silent, when foreign advisors disappeared into flights back home, Traoré stayed. Not because he wanted power, but because the land needed someone who would not leave. He had no Marshall Plan, no glossy brochures, just a battered table carved from local wood, and on that table he placed one thing: choice. He did not beg for aid, he invited partnership. Russia sent military advisors, Turkey offered construction, India brought renewable tech, and China, as always, came with contracts. But Traoré didn't kneel, He negotiated. Each deal came with a clause. We do not surrender our soil. We do not sell our silence. Burkina Faso was no longer playing on someone else's board. It was building its own. Traoré called it the New Compact, not just for Burkina Faso, but for any African nation tired of waiting, tired of asking, tired of explaining poverty on a land soaked in gold. And this time, no Western capital got to moderate the room. Foreign newspapers called him unpredictable. Washington labeled him a risky populist, but in the markets of Ouagadougou, people whispered something else. He did not come to sell us. He came to stay. There is a moment in every story when silence breaks. For Burkina Faso, it was not a protest, not an explosion. It was the planting of solar panels on the roofs of village schools. It was the renegotiation of mining contracts that once handed away 90% of profit. It was local farmers growing cotton for local factories. It was dignity. And it happened quietly, so quietly that America didn't notice, until it tried to come back and realized there was no seat left for it. And here is your question, audience to this unfolding history. What do you do when the one who used to dominate the table wants back in, but only after walking out? Comment below with New Africa. If you believe it's time we decide who sits at the table. When power walks out of a room, it expects to be missed. But Burkina Faso didn't miss America. Neither did Mali, nor Niger, nor the growing list of nations who once shaped their security around someone else's elections. Instead, they adapted, quietly, boldly. Ghana deepened ties with China. Kenya redrew trade routes to the Gulf. South Africa doubled down on BRICS diplomacy. Ethiopia negotiated with Beijing, but refused to yield internal control. Across the continent, a strange thing was happening. Africa stopped asking permission. And that was the shift Washington didn't anticipate. In Pentagon halls, they ran simulations. Would chaos erupt without U.S. presence? Would terrorism surge? Would leaders beg for return? None of that happened. Instead, Burkina Faso turned to Russia, not for salvation, but for leverage. Not to replace the West, but to remind it, we have options now. The West thought its absence would cause collapse. All it did was remove the ceiling. Young Africans no longer waited for CNN headlines. They shared updates through encrypted apps, local radios, street posters. The slogans were no longer in English or French. They were in Fula Wolof Moray. And they didn't say help us. They said, we are rewriting the terms. There is a kind of confidence that doesn't shout. It doesn't wear suits or attend global summits. It shows up in a woman reopening a closed clinic with local herbs, a farmer organizing a co-op to bypass foreign buyers, a captain standing in a dusty capital saying no to soldiers in foreign uniform. That's the kind of confidence spreading across Africa, and it unnerves those used to being begged. For Trump, the silence was misread. He expected chaos. He got indifference. Because by the time America looked back, Africa had built a new map, and it didn't need old names. Now, a question for you, especially if you are part of the diaspora. What if Africa never needed saving? What if it just needed to stop being interrupted? If that hits you deep, comment below. Africa Rise. There was a time when every African summit had one empty chair reserved for the one who came with conditions. A flag, a fund, a timeline. But now something had shifted. That chair was no longer empty. It was gone. And in its place sat the farmers, the women, the local commanders. They did not speak perfect English. They did not need to, because this time the table was theirs. Ibrahim Traore did not just remove the old agreements. He rewrote the very idea of agreement. No more aid packages tied to morality lectures. No more development funds contingent on foreign contractors. No more applause for dignity leased by the hour. His Burkina Faso stood and said, "We don't want gifts. We want terms we can live with." The Pentagon might still claim it had 6,000 personnel on the continent, but ask any village in Sahel, and they'll tell you the only boots they saw were their own. What Trump believed was a strategic withdrawal was read by Africans as a quiet confirmation we were never the priority, so they stopped pretending otherwise. No more high-level partnership photo shoots while hospitals lacked gloves. No more joint task force briefings while schools had no roofs. No more joint statements, just joint survival. Burkina Faso did not collapse, it clarified, and so did the continent. From Senegal to Somalia, a new understanding bloomed: power that arrives with conditions, leaves with excuses, but dignity roots itself. At a youth forum in Koudougou, a 17-year-old stood up and asked if Americans trained our army for 10 years. Why are the rebels still gaining land? There was no answer, only a sigh from the elder next to him, because training is not sovereignty, and presence is not protection. The world didn't hear that moment, but Africa did, and it echoed louder than any summit. Manbriyaf. Now, to you, yes, you who are watching from the diaspora, if your homeland stopped waiting for permission, would you finally come home with your own terms? If that question speaks to you, comment below, "I stand with Traoré." Because this is not just about a captain, it's about a continent no longer on its knees. Let us speak plainly. America did not lose Africa. It walked away believing no one would notice, believing the room would freeze without it, believing the light switch was only on its side of the wall. But Africa did not beg for it to return. Africa built a new room, and the light, it came from a solar panel, mounted by a local boy in Burkina Faso. This story was never about Trump. It was about what happened when the camera turned away, when the planes took off, when the wires were unplugged, and still life continued. Not chaotically, not in flames, but in resolve. Ibrahim Traore was not America's project. He was Africa's memory made flesh. He walked where the diplomats feared to step. He listened where others gave orders. And he stood not because he had power, but because he refused to be bent. That is the twist the West didn't script. While Trump framed withdrawal as power, Africa saw it for what it was: irrelevance wrapped in arrogance. Today across the continent, something deeper is unfolding. Local leaders once dismissed as fringe are now redrawing boundaries. Youth who were once told to emigrate are staying to build. Mothers who buried children from hunger are planting again. Scholars are writing in local tongues. Entrepreneurs are scaling solar, not just dreams. And every move carries the same message: we waited long enough, now we choose. Yamian. Burkina Faso is not perfect. There are challenges: poverty, conflict, corruption. But for the first time in decades, those problems are not being solved by outsiders holding clipboards. They're being faced by the people who bleed when things break, and that matters. Because what Africa has been denied for too long is the dignity of failure. Not failure caused by exploitation, but the freedom to fail and rise again on our own terms. This is the new revolution. It is not televised. It is not funded by think tanks. It doesn't wear suits or stage summits. It shows up in choices, choosing to ban foreign media that distort truth, choosing to say no to loans with colonizer interest rates, choosing to define success without Western applause. So I war for And so we ask again, what now, America? Do you think Africa waits by the door hoping for your return? Or do you see what has already happened, a continent no longer begging but building? A continent no longer afraid of silence, but using it as strategy. A continent where no is not rebellion, it's just a boundary. We are not angry, we are not fragile, we are simply done with waiting. And for those watching from afar, especially those who share our blood, our rhythm, our grief, the time is now. Not to save Africa, but to return to it, return in voice, return in thought, return in dignity. Traoré may be one man, but he stood so others could remember how. Because when history forgets you, sometimes you have to write it back with your feet. Let this be the lesson. Power is not presence, control is not care, and relevance is earned, not inherited. So, here is your moment not just to watch, but to act. Comment New Africa. If you believe the continent is not being born, it is rising from what was always there. Comment I stand with Traoré. If you believe leadership comes not from alliances, but from courage. Comment Africa rise. If you believe the silence of Burkina Faso is louder than any speech from the West. And if you feel something stir inside you, don't let this story end here. Let it move you, let it trouble you. Let it make you call someone tonight and ask, did you know? They didn't wait because they didn't. They stood, they walked, they rewrote. And now the question is not whether Africa will rise, it's whether we will rise with it. Subscribe not for me, not for clicks, but for the dream of a continent that no longer needs permission to speak. The table has turned, and this time Africa brought its own seat. There are moments in history that aren't marked by gunfire or flags being lowered, but by something quieter, the absence of noise. In the case of Burkina Faso, that silence came when the Americans packed up and left. No farewell speeches, no headlines, just the mechanical hum of cargo planes and the shutting down of bases. For decades, Africa had been told that such silence would be fatal, that without Western presence, chaos would reign. But then something unexpected. And in that moment, we learned a lesson that has echoed across a continent Africa never needed saving. It needed space. When the U.S. left Burkina Faso, the world expected collapse. But what unfolded was not weakness but awakening. No riots, no begging, no cries for return. Instead, people stood taller, looked inward, and began to reimagine what was possible when they were no longer defined by who stood next to them, but by what stood within them. This wasn't just the exit of a foreign army, it was the removal of a mirror that had distorted Africa's eye to eye. The heart of the lesson lies in Ibrahim. If they leave, we must learn. His leadership wasn't born from Western validation, but from absence from a void that he refused to let become a vacuum. Where others would have begged, he negotiated. Where others saw weakness, he saw opportunity. That is the first great lesson. Real power begins when dependency ends. For too long, Africa has been framed through a colonial lens, a land of need waiting for charity development and direction. But what Traoré showed, what Burkina Faso proved, is that when the facade of help is stripped away, what's left is something more honest. Harder, yes, but real. They say America shifted its burden, but in truth, it shifted its mask. For years, foreign aid had become a theater of control money, with conditioned security with strings, partnerships with fine print. But the people on the ground, the farmers, the youth, the soldiers, they weren't blind. They saw the illusion. And when it finally disappeared, they didn't panic. They adapted. This is the second lesson: absence is not loss. It is clarity. When the helicopters flew off and embassies emptied, what remained was not despair, it was a blank page. And for the first time in decades, Burkina Faso began to write its own terms. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was revolutionary. Solar panels went up on village schools. Mining contracts were rewritten to favor locals. Small farmers organized against exploitative buyers. And suddenly what was once called foreign aid was exposed as foreign leverage. Traoré refused to kneel before new powers, even as he opened the door to them. Russia, India, Turkey, China. They were welcomed, but not worshipped. Every agreement carried one message. We will not surrender our soil. We will not sell our silence. This is the third lesson. Partnership is not submission. Sovereignty is non-negotiable. Washington labeled him a populist. The Western press called him unpredictable. But in the markets of Ouagadougou, mothers and traders whispered something different. He stayed. That in a world of disappearing promises was power. There is a kind of revolution that doesn't march in parades. It shows up in decisions, in choosing not to renew aid contracts, in saying no to exploitative loans, in rewriting the terms of diplomacy. That's what is happening across Africa today, and not just in Burkina Faso. From Ghana to South Africa, from Kenya to Ethiopia, governments and people alike are no longer asking, will they support us? They are asking, do we need them at all? This is the fourth lesson. Reclaiming dignity is more powerful than receiving support. What the West misunderstood was that Africa's silence was not submission. It was strategy. It was observation. It was a waiting game, and now it's over. Because today, African voices are not filtered through Western studios. They speak in local languages, in local actions, in decisions made without waiting for foreign applause. When the West left, it expected chaos. What it got was indifference, and that shook the foundations of old assumptions more than any riot ever could. Now there's a final question posed to those of us watching, especially the African diaspora, or anyone who still believes that leadership must be validated from abroad. What if Africa never needed saving? What if it simply needed the world to get out of the way? This is not a romanticized vision of the continent. The challenges remain conflict, corruption, poverty, but what has changed is who owns those problems, and more importantly, who gets to define the solutions. For decades, Africa's failures have been foreign-funded. Now for the first time, its future is being locally authored. And that is the ultimate lesson. Freedom is not the absence of war. It is the presence of choice. Burkina Faso didn't rise because the West left. It rose because it finally saw itself clearly, humbly, powerfully. Traoré didn't ask for applause. He asked for terms he could live with. In that dusty capital, at a table carved from local wood, he planted a new flag, not of conquest, but of clarity. And now, the table is turned. Africa brought its own seat. So, if you're still listening, remember this. The most radical thing a continent can do after centuries of interruption is not to fight for inclusion in someone else's story. It is to write its own. And that story has already begun. The story of Burkina Faso under Traoré is not simply one of defiance, it is one of redefinition. For decades, resistance in Africa was often reduced to protests, coups, or fiery speeches at international summits. But what we see today is something far more strategic, a quiet restructuring of purpose, values, and identity, led not by bureaucrats in glass towers, but by ordinary people doing extraordinary things with limited means. Burkina Faso did not overthrow the global order, it reoriented itself away from it. And in doing so, it reminded the world that to be sovereign is not to be alone, it is to be deliberate. Every choice made without needing validation from abroad became a political act. Every school built without foreign blueprints, every factory powered by locally sourced energy, every soldier trained without foreign doctrine, these became bricks in a new foundation. And that leads to another crucial lesson. Development is not a gift. It is a decision. When the West left, what they left behind was not a vacuum, but a challenge. Would Burkina Faso revert to dependency, or would it adapt? Traoré chose the harder path. He refused to exchange one master for another. He welcomed new partners, yes, but only on Burkina Faso's terms. No troops without accountability, no loans without transparency, no agreements without dignity. This strategy, dubbed the New Compact, was not just a slogan. It was a signal to other African nations, to young leaders, to the global South. You don't have to wait to be invited to the table. You can build your own, and many are listening. Across the continent, this ethos is spreading. Senegal is renegotiating its fishing deals. Nigeria is reviewing Chinese infrastructure loans. Uganda is asserting control over rare earth minerals. These are not isolated events. They are signs of a continent slowly replacing permission with purpose. This is not to say the West has no role, but it is no longer the only player. Africa is opening its options diplomatically, economically, and culturally. It is building alliances not to flatter the powerful, but to balance power. And in that lies a warning. The era of monopoly is over. If Washington, Paris, or Brussels still believe they hold the keys to Africa's future, they are decades behind. Because today's African youth are not waiting in visa lines. They are building apps in Dakar, launching solar farms in Niamey, starting universities in Kisangani. They are no longer looking out the window for salvation. They are looking at the soil beneath them and realizing everything we were told we lacked, we already had. This is the new revolution. It is not anti-West, it is post-West. A phase where partnership must replace paternalism, where listening must replace lecturing, where dignity must replace dependency. And that leads us to perhaps the most uncomfortable truth for those still clinging to old paradigms. Silence is no longer a weakness, it is a strategy. When Burkina Faso said nothing as the last Western convoy left, it wasn't because it was stunned, it was because it understood that presence doesn't equal protection, and absence doesn't equal abandonment. It was the silence of recalibration, of resetting expectations, of preparing the ground for something new to grow. That silence also sent a message to the diaspora. Your homeland no longer needs saving, it needs returning. Not just physically, but intellectually, emotionally, spiritually. It needs its scattered children to return, not with blueprints from Harvard or UN manuals, but with commitment, with eyes that see its value without waiting for CNN to validate it, with voices that can speak truth in both Wolof and English Swahili, and French not as translators, but as bridges. And that invites a deeper reflection. If the old powers walked away because they thought we couldn't stand, what will they do when they see that we are walking forward? This question is not rhetorical. It's already being answered in panic meetings, in shifting foreign policies, in sudden visits from diplomats who once refused to take African leaders seriously. But Burkina Faso's reply is calm, even gracious. We're not rejecting you. We're simply no longer waiting for you. This is dignity, not as performance, but as posture. Traoré did not raise his voice to be heard. He simply stood when others sat. And in that standing, he embodied something we often forget. Leadership is not granted by external power. It is earned through internal clarity. That is why he resonates not just in Burkina Faso, but in Congo, in Zimbabwe, in Tanzania, and in the hearts of Africans across the world. Not because he is perfect, but because he is present. And in an age of manufactured authenticity, that presence speaks louder than any speech. So where does this leave us? It leaves us at a crossroads. One path continues the old ways of dependence dressed as diplomacy of photo ops, masking exploitation of endless aid reports that change nothing. The other path is uncertain, unpaved, unpolished, but it is ours. And that brings us to the final truth of this lesson. Freedom is not comfort. It is responsibility. Burkina Faso is not a utopia. It still faces insurgencies. It still struggles with poverty, internal division, and fragile infrastructure. But for the first time in decades, its future is not being outsourced. Its destiny is being written in local ink by local hands. And that more than anything is what America didn't anticipate, that withdrawal would not cause collapse. It would cause clarity. Because when you take away the scaffolding, you finally see the structure. And what we are seeing across Africa is not an empty frame, but a rising foundation, one built on local vision, one fueled by continental memory, one carried forward not by resentment, but by renewal. A continent once viewed as a liability is revealing itself as the world's future laboratory of resilience, innovation, and redefined power. Let this be the enduring truth. Africa is not waiting. Africa is not watching. Africa is walking. And in that walk, a lesson for the whole world power begins the moment you stop asking for permission. When a people begin to walk on their own terms, the world watches with unease, not because it fears chaos, but because it fears irrelevance. For centuries, Africa was the continent others shaped, spoke for, and defined. Its borders were drawn by foreign hands. Its stories were written in foreign tongues. Its worth was measured in extraction gold oil, cocoa diamonds, but never in dignity. That has changed. And with that change comes a new burden, not to seek justice from others, but to deliver it ourselves. This is the new burden of Africa, not to prove value, but to protect it. For so long we were taught that freedom meant being left alone. But real freedom means something more profound. It means refusing to be reduced by pity, by praise, by pressure. It means holding the line when new powers knock, with the same old intentions, wearing different uniforms. When Traoré said, "We do not surrender our soil," he wasn't only speaking about land, he was speaking about memory, about agency, about a future that cannot be rented out even in hard times. Because what is at stake now is not simply resource control, it is narrative control. And here lies a critical lesson. Those who do not control their story will always be cast as characters in someone else's plot. Burkina Faso reclaimed its story not with a declaration, but with a decision to stay still when others fled to plant, when others predicted famine to lead, when leadership was declared too risky. And that act of staying, of not collapsing, was enough to unravel the myth that Africa cannot stand on its own. But what happens after the myth breaks? What comes next? What comes is responsibility, and that responsibility is immense. Because for the first time, the question is not, what will they do to us, but what will we do with ourselves? Now that the West has stepped back, now that the spotlight is gone, the silence becomes ours to fill, and we must fill it not with imitation, but with imagination. That means defining progress in African terms. It means rejecting GDP as the sole metric of success and replacing it with real indicators: food security, community health, cultural preservation, youth retention. It means creating schools that don't just prepare children to leave, but to stay and lead. It means knowing that sovereignty without systems is just sentiment. This is not just about symbolism. It is about systems that reflect sovereignty, courts that are fair, contracts that are transparent, media that speak truth to power, militaries that defend borders, not budgets, universities that teach not only English or French, but ethics rooted in African thought. Because the most dangerous thing about freedom is not losing it, it is misusing it. Traoré has done something rare. He did not seize power and seek comfort. He sought correction of the story, of the structure, of the soul of the state. But he is not the revolution, he is only its reminder. The revolution is this: when a continent no longer asks, "Who will save us?" but instead asks, "What will we now build together?" And this question is now yours if you are African. Will you keep waiting for the next president, the next partner, the next promise? Or will you become the author of the next page? And if you are not African but watching, curious, perhaps even uncomfortable, the question shifts. Will you respect Africa's choice, even when it doesn't flatter your interests? Will you support it not with conditions but with respect? Because the future does not belong to those who fund it. It belongs to those who live it. And Africa is choosing finally to live forward, not upward. Forward means partnerships rooted in shared destiny, not charity. Forward means institutions built on trust, not on foreign templates. Forward means art that reflects real pain and real hope, not just foreign grants. This is the creative explosion now underway. African architects are designing cities for climate, not cars. Local musicians are building industries without record labels in Paris. Writers are publishing without needing translation into global languages. And in the villages, mothers are teaching children history not from textbooks, but from land, from scars, from songs. This is the work of rewriting identity, and that work is the hardest of all, because it is not about slogans, it is about soul-searching, it is not about speeches, it is about systems, it is not about resisting the West, it is about becoming whole without it. That's what Burkina Faso represents now. Not defiance, but definition, and there is no going back. When Washington or Paris tries to re-engage, they find a different tone waiting. One that says, we are not angry, we are not your enemy, but we are not your project either. And that is the voice of maturity of a continent that has stopped apologizing for surviving. It is the voice of a continent that has finally accepted we were never weak. We were simply interrupted. Now the interruptions have ended. Now the microphone is ours. Now the question is no longer whether the world will listen. The question is whether we will keep speaking in our own terms, to our own people, for our own future. Because we cannot build a new Africa with borrowed tools. We must craft it from within. And that begins with believing not in what others see in us, but in what we see in ourselves. So the lesson ultimately is this: Africa does not rise because it is helped. Africa rises because it remembers. Remembers who it was before the maps. Remembers what it endured without breaking. Remembers the languages, the laughter, the losses. Remembers that dignity is not given, it is claimed. And it is time. Time not to celebrate too early. Not to pretend the work is done, but to kneel beside the foundation and keep building. For the next generation, not just to inherit sovereignty, but to live it.